Afghanistan, August 12, 2019, 0200 hours. The mountain had no name on any map that mattered. Elaine Carter had been lying still for 4 hours. The rock beneath her was cold enough to pull heat from her body through 3 layers of clothing, and she let it. Cold kept you focused. Cold kept you honest. She pressed her cheek against the stock of her Barrett and breathed in the smell of gun oil and dry mountain air, and the stillness that only exists at altitude in the dark when the world below has no idea you are watching it. The compound sat at the base of the valley. Low walls, 2 guards on the eastern corner, a generator humming somewhere inside. Lamplight behind shuttered windows. From 1,400 meters through a Night Force scope, it looked like a photograph of somewhere ordinary. A farmhouse, a family home, nothing that deserved what was about to happen to it. Her radio crackled once. The voice was calm, the way voices get when they have practiced being calm for so long that calm becomes its own kind of mask. Ghost 7, target confirmed. You are cleared to engage. She found the target in her scope. A man crossing from one building to another. 52 years old according to the briefing. Gray beard. A scar across his left eyebrow, though she could not see that from here. She had memorized his face from a photograph taken in Kabul, and she matched it now to the figure moving through the amber glow of a single outdoor light. She exhaled slowly, found the space between heartbeats, squeezed. The rifle fired, and the man fell, and for 1/2 second, everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. Then the building exploded. Not the way buildings explode when one thing goes wrong. The way they explode when someone planned for them to explode. A shaped detonation, low and deliberate, consuming the entire eastern structure in a single rolling wall of light and pressure that pushed heat across the valley floor and lit the underside of the clouds orange for 3 seconds before the dark returned. The sound reached her 2 seconds later, long and hollow across the valley. And by then she was already moving, already off the ridge, already running because Omega Team was inside that compound and Omega Team had stopped answering. She ran for 11 minutes down the slope. She covered every meter with the kind of hope that is really just the refusal to accept what you already know. When she reached the compound walls, there was nothing left to save. She stood in the ash, in the heat, and the silence, and she understood that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be fixed by running harder or shooting straighter or being better at any of the things she had spent 20 years learning to be. 4 names entered her mind and stayed there. Park, Johnson, Thompson, Williams. They had names, they had faces. They had people somewhere who did not yet know what this night had cost them. Elaine Carter stood in the ruins at the base of a nameless mountain in Afghanistan and became in that moment a woman carrying a weight that no investigation, no official report, no board of inquiry would ever fully see. Fort Carson, Colorado, September 2022. 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days later, she counted ammunition. Specifically, she was counting 5. 56mm rounds in a steel-shelved storage room that smelled of solvent and cardboard, and the particular sadness of fluorescent lighting at 7 in the morning. She had a clipboard. She had a pen. She had a method left shelf to write, top to bottom, confirmed against requisition records dating back 6 months. And she executed that method with the same precision she had once applied to problems that no one in this room would have recognized as problems at all. Her name tag read Carter E. The designation beneath it said Supply Specialist. She was 47 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall. Her hands were pale and uncalloused from 3 years of paperwork, and her hair was regulation length and unremarkable. And there was nothing about her standing in that supply room in the early morning of a Tuesday in September that would cause any reasonable person to look twice. That was the point. She had been very deliberate about the point. At 7:30, a junior specialist knocked on the door and told her that General Harmon had requested all non-essential personnel attend the morning demonstration at Range 7. Elaine did not particularly want to attend the morning demonstration at Range 7. She went anyway because declining would have required an explanation, and explanations attracted attention, and Elaine Carter had spent 3 years becoming a woman to whom no one paid attention. Range 7 sat at the eastern edge of Fort Carson, and in the early morning of a September day in Colorado, the mountains to the west were just beginning to catch the first pale light of sunrise, while the range itself remained in shadow. The bleachers were filling fast. More than 200 soldiers, NCOs, and officers settled into rows of metal seats that had already begun to absorb the heat of the approaching day. Elaine sat in the last row. From here, she could see the range clearly. The firing line, the target indicators at intervals along the 1,000-meter mark, the 2,000, and at the very end, barely visible through the morning haze, the steel plate at 3,800 meters. It was the size of a door. At that distance, it looked like a thumbnail pressed against the horizon. She watched the preparations without expression. Master Sergeant Derek Walsh was already at the firing line. She had seen Walsh before, the way you see people in a place where everyone eventually sees everyone, in the mess hall in the quarters of the headquarters building on the range roads. He was 6 feet 2 inches of assembled confidence, broad through the shoulders, with the bearing of a man who has been told he is exceptional often enough that he has stopped questioning it. He was one of the best marksmen on base. Everyone knew it. He knew it most of all. He was also making a mistake. Not a large mistake. Not the kind obvious to anyone watching casually. But she had been reading wind indicators her entire adult life, and the flags along Range 7 were telling a story that Walsh had not finished reading. The thermal column rising from the asphalt of the parking area to the south was creating a pressure differential that shifted at the 2,000-meter mark. At 3,800 meters, that shift compounded into something that would not be felt or seen without knowing exactly where to look. She said nothing. Walsh settled into prone position, worked the bolt of his precision rifle, and fired. The steel plate at 3,800 meters did not move. A murmur ran through the bleachers. Not shock, not yet. More like recalibration. Walsh fired again. Miss. Again. Miss. By the fourth shot, the murmur had become something quieter and less comfortable. By the seventh, people had stopped talking altogether. Walsh stood up. He pulled his cap from his head and threw it into the dirt with a force that said everything about what was happening inside his chest. He was a man who had built his identity around a specific kind of excellence, and this morning, in front of 200 witnesses, that identity was coming apart at the joints. Then General Ruth Harmon spoke. Harmon was 58 years old and had earned her 3 stars, the way 3 stars are actually earned, not through proximity to the right people, but through 30 years of decisions that worked out and decisions that did not, and the accumulation of judgment that comes from living honestly with both. She stood at the edge of the range with her hands behind her back and her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face, and when she spoke, her voice carried the length of the range without effort. Is there anyone else who would like to try? It was not quite a question. 10 more men went to the firing line over the next 40 minutes. Some of them were genuinely skilled. Some were faster and more practiced than Walsh. One of them, a staff sergeant named Griggs, who had 3 confirmed long-range qualifications, came within a meter of the target on his second shot and looked briefly hopeful before his third and fourth shots went wide. All 11 failed. The silence that followed the 11th missed shot was the silence of collective embarrassment. 200 soldiers sitting with the shared understanding that something had been attempted and not achieved, and that there was no clean way to move past it. General Harmon let the silence sit for 10 full seconds. Then from the last row of the bleachers, a hand went up. It was not a confident gesture, not dramatic, simply a hand rising slowly into the September air, the hand of a woman in a supply uniform who had been sitting quietly in the back for the better part of an hour. The reaction traveled through the crowd the way your reactions travel, person to person, nudge to nudge, until 200 heads had turned toward the source. Elaine lowered her hand and stood. Walsh looked at her the way experienced soldiers look at things that are out of place, not with cruelty exactly, but with the automatic dismissal of someone who has been in the system long enough to know what belongs where. His voice carried without him raising it particularly. What exactly do you think you're going to do up here? A few people laughed, then more. Elaine walked towards the firing line and the crowd parted around her, the way crowds part around something they expect to fail, creating space not out of respect, but out of the desire to see clearly. She reached the firing line and looked down at the rifle Walsh had left in the dirt. It was a precision rifle chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, with a scope that had cost more than most used cars. It weighed unloaded just under 15 pounds. Walsh had left it lying in the Colorado dirt like something that had let him down, which was not. Elaine thought an entirely unfair assessment of the morning. She bent and picked it up. Captain James Wren was sitting 12 rows back in the bleachers, and the moment Elaine's hands closed around the rifle, he stood up. Not dramatically. He simply rose from his seat, and the man beside him gave him a questioning look, and Wren did not respond because he was watching something that had no business being seen in front of 200 people on a Tuesday morning. She held the rifle the way a craftsman holds a familiar tool, with the absent, practiced ease of a body that does not need to think about the object in its hands, because the relationship between them was established long ago and thoroughly. She conducted her inspection methodically. Barrel, chamber, scope mount, trigger. The bolt she cycled once, and the sound it made was clean and precise, the sound of something functioning exactly as designed. Walsh stood 12 feet away, and watched her hands with the expression of a man whose certainty about what he is seeing has just split cleanly in two. Then she put the rifle down and read the wind, not with instruments. She was watching the grass between her position and the target, not the grass immediately in front of her, but the grass at the 1,000-meter mark, the 2,000, observing the patterns of movement that revealed wind speed and direction at different distances. She picked up a handful of loose dirt and let it fall through her fingers, tracking how the particles dispersed in the air. She wet one finger and held it up, reading the temperature differential across its surface, a technique for detecting thermal columns rising from heated ground that was not taught in standard instruction, but learned through years of fieldwork. Technical Sergeant Victor Hale, the base's senior ballistics instructor, had stopped mid-sentence in a conversation nearby. He moved to the edge of the bleachers and watched. He called out to her. He asked in a voice designed for the audience around him whether she knew what the Coriolis effect was, whether she understood ballistic coefficients for varying atmospheric conditions. It was framed as a technical challenge, but what it really was the last reasonable defense of the order that was currently dissolving in front of him. Without looking up from the scope, Elaine spoke. Her voice was quiet. It carried anyway. Range 3,800 meters. Wind 12 knots from the southwest, gusting to 15. Temperature 78 degrees. Humidity 32%. Elevation 4,800 feet above sea level. Barometric pressure 29.92. She paused for one beat. Earth rotation adjustment during 4.2 seconds of flight time, 0.03 degrees. Coriolis correction at this latitude, 14 inches right. The bleachers went very quiet. Those were not approximate numbers. Those were not guesses dressed in technical language. Hale had taught the mathematics of long-range shooting for 9 years. And what Elaine Carter had just recited without instruments, without calculation, down aids in the time it takes to draw a breath was within fractions of what he would have arrived at after several minutes with a ballistics calculator and an atmospheric data feed. He put his phone back in his pocket. A minute passed. 90 seconds. The flags along the range, which had been snapping steadily in one direction all morning, began to shift. The thermal column from the parking area was creating exactly the window she had described, a corridor of briefly stable air, aligned for perhaps 30 seconds before the morning heat reasserted itself and the pattern broke apart again. Her breathing stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The finger on the trigger began its slow, continuous squeeze. Not a pull, never a pull, a squeeze. The distinction being the difference between a shot that goes where you intend it and a shot that goes where your body moves when the nervous system fires and the rifle discharged. The sound was clean and flat and specific. The recoil was absorbed without visible movement. 4.2 seconds. 200 people looked at the electronic display at the far end of range 7, and the display showed them something that none of the previous 11 men had produced that morning. Target hit. Dead center. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then the bleachers erupted, not in celebration because the crowd did not know how to celebrate this, but in chaos. People stood, people pushed forward. Walsh was at the spotting scope before anyone registered that he had moved his eye pressed to the eyepiece, his body very still. When he straightened up, his face had changed. He said something under his breath. The word impossible appeared somewhere in it. Elaine stood up from the firing position. As she rose, the motion caused her collar to shift the fabric, catching briefly on the rifle's sling. There was a small tearing sound. The collar pulled to one side, and what was revealed there on the pale skin at the base of her neck was the edge of a tattoo. Not large, not decorative. A skull with a number worked into the design and a curved line of text beneath it in Latin. Characters too small to read from a distance, but the overall shape of the mark unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in certain rooms with certain clearances. Specialist Tyler Moss was standing at the edge of the bleachers with his laptop open. He had been running searches since Elaine picked up the rifle, working through personnel databases with the focused curiosity of someone who recognizes that something does not fit the category it has been assigned to. Most searches returned exactly what you would expect: 3 years of supply records, perfect inventory accuracy, not a single disciplinary action. Clean, unremarkable. The profile of someone who had always been exactly what they appeared to be. But her records before those 3 years were not classified in the ordinary way. They were not restricted to a higher clearance level. They were absent, not sealed, not redacted, gone in the way that information is gone when someone with considerable resources has decided it should no longer exist. He found one fragment, a line item in a budget allocation report from 4 years earlier, 4 words and a status. Ghost 7 operational. He looked up from his laptop. He looked at Elaine Carter standing at the firing line. He said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said for him. General Harmon had moved closer during the shot. She had been watching Elaine's hands throughout the micro-adjustments to the scope, the wind reading the quality of stillness achieved in the final seconds before firing. Harmon had watched thousands of soldiers handle weapons across 30 years of service. She had learned to read competence the way other people read faces. What she had been watching for the last 20 minutes was not the competence of someone who had been taught. It was the competence of someone who had been formed. Harmon's phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. The message was from a number with a Langley prefix. 4 words, "Do not pursue further." She looked at Elaine. She put the phone in her pocket. When Harmon spoke, the range went quiet immediately, the way it goes quiet for 3 stars regardless of surrounding noise. She used Elaine's name, not the name on the supply clerk's tag, but the full name and the rank, the real rank, not the cover designation. A date, a place. Sergeant First Class Elaine Carter. Go 7, Kandahar, August 2019. The words hit the assembled crowd with the force of information that reorganizes everything around it. 200 people who had spent the last hour watching a supply clerk do something inexplicable were now being told in a general's voice that the supply clerk had never been a supply clerk. Captain Wren sat back down slowly. He had known for 3 years. He had received a classified briefing when Elaine's transfer orders came through, been told to observe and not interfere, and he had kept that knowledge in a locked room inside himself for 1,095 days. He realized now, relieved. Walsh stood very still for a moment. Something moved through his face, not embarrassment, not yet, not precisely, more like the expression of a man watching a building he thought was stable reveal a foundation nobody had told him about. He walked toward Elaine, not to apologize, not to perform anything in front of the crowd. He stopped in front of her with his hands at his sides and his voice pitched low, and he asked the honest question, stripped of everything else. Why 3 years in a supply room? Elaine looked at him. The tattoo was visible now, the skull, the number, the Latin text that, if you knew enough to translate it, said death from a great distance. Because I killed 7 people, she said. Walsh held her gaze. He didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else to say. Not yet, not here with 200 people watching and the morning sun climbing above the range and the video of the shot already moving across every connected device within range of a cell tower. From the parking lot, a figure was walking toward them. Older man, civilian clothes, but the walk was military in the way that military never fully leaves the body. Weathered face, mid-60s. The age visible not as diminishment, but as accumulated weight, someone who has been doing difficult things for a long time and expects to continue. Colonel Frank Decker, retired, former commander of the Army's Advanced Marksmanship Program. The man who had a decade ago, and under conditions no unclassified document would fully describe Train Go 7. He walked through the edge of the crowd without acknowledging any of it, stopped in front of Elaine and looked at her the way a craftsman looks at something he built a long time ago and has not seen since. Nobody is stupid enough to attempt that shot, he said, except the one person in this country who could actually make it. Elaine didn't respond. Decker glanced at the target display, still showing its readout. He looked at Walsh standing nearby with the stillness of a man in the middle of a recalibration he had not finished. He looked at the phone in Harmon's pocket, which had not rung again. The video has 5 million views, Moss said from behind his laptop. His voice was slightly unsteady. News outlets are picking up the headline. Harmon looked at the sky the way experienced officers look at the sky when they are measuring the size of a problem against their available resources. Elaine Carter stood at the firing line of Range 7 at Fort Carson, Colorado in September of 2022, with the weight of 3 years and 4 names and 1 perfect shot settling around her like weather. She had not wanted this. She had wanted the storage room. The fluorescent light, the clipboards and the count sheets, and the precise invisibility of a person whose usefulness to the world had been reduced by their own deliberate choice to the accurate tallying of objects in a room. She had wanted that because wanting that was easier than wanting the truth about what had happened at the base of a nameless mountain in Afghanistan in August of 2019. And the truth was large and jagged and had been pressing against the inside of her chest for 1,127 days without relief. She looked at her hands, the hands that had filed requisition forms for 3 years, the hands that had carried the Barrett to the firing line 20 minutes ago, the hands that had on the night that organized everything else into before and after squeezed a trigger and sent a bullet through 4 seconds of dark mountain air into a man who was not who she had been told he was in a compound that had been prepared for her arrival. She had not known that last part yet, but something was about to change that. The crowd did not disperse. That was the first thing Elaine noticed. In the 10 minutes following General Harmon's announcement, nobody moved toward the exits. 200 soldiers stood or sat in the September heat of Range 7 phones, raised conversations, suspended, all of them watching her with the look of people who do not yet have a category for what they are seeing. She was no longer the supply clerk who had made an impossible shot. She was now the impossible shot and something else beneath it, something the name Ghost 7 implied without explaining. She stood at the firing line and did not speak, and the crowd watched her. Not speaking, and the morning got hotter. Colonel Decker positioned himself slightly behind her right shoulder, not obtrusively, not in a way that announced itself as protection, just close enough that anyone moving toward Elaine with purpose would have to move through him first, and Decker was the kind of man whose physical presence communicated without effort or intention that this would not be a comfortable experience. General Harmon was on her radio. Walsh had not walked away. He stood 12 feet from Elaine with his arms crossed and his cap retrieved from the dirt, wearing the expression of a man reassessing an entire morning's worth of assumptions and finding the process deeply uncomfortable. He was not a man who enjoyed being wrong. But he was, Elaine had noticed in their brief exchange, a man capable of recognizing it, which was a different thing, and in her experience, considerably rarer. It was Specialist Moss who saw it first. He was still at his laptop at the edge of the bleachers, still running searches that returned walls of classification and fragments of nothing. His screen changed. He looked at it twice. He said in a voice that came out quieter than he intended that everyone needed to see this. PFC. Audrey Finch arrived at a run from the direction of the headquarters building, tablet in hand, slightly out of breath, in the way of someone who has covered more ground than expected. She was young, 23, maybe 24, with the look of someone accustomed to delivering information and uncertain how this particular information was going to land. She held the tablet up to Elaine. The screen showed a live video feed, deliberately grainy, obscured through choice rather than technical limitation. A room with no identifiable features. Concrete wall behind the speaker. A single lamp creating a cone of amber light, shadows doing careful work on the perimeter. A man sat in the center of the frame. Civilian clothes. Face turned slightly away from the direct light, enough to make precise identification difficult, not enough to make it impossible. He was speaking. His voice had the quality of someone who has rehearsed what they want to say until the words come out flat and deliberate, each one placed where it is meant to go. A Boston accent underneath, not strong, worn down by years of military service to a ghost of itself, surfacing only on certain sounds, certain vowels. Ghost 7. I know you're at Fort Carson. I know what happened this morning. And I know you've been living with what happened in Kandahar for 3 years, believing something about that night that isn't true. My name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Briggs. Omega 2. I am officially listed as killed in action on August 12, 2019. I'm recording this from a location inside the United States. I'm alive, and I need you to hear what I'm about to say. Elaine's face did not move, but her right hand hanging at her side closed slowly into a fist. The video continued. Briggs spoke with the measured pace of someone making a legal statement, which was, Elaine understood probably exactly what this was. A record deliberately constructed, intended to exist regardless of what happened next. He was not performing. He was not appealing for sympathy. He was stating facts in the sequence they needed to be stated. 4 members of Omega Team were dead before you fired that night, he said. The compound had been rigged before we entered, before your shot. I need you to understand that in its correct order, because the order is the entire story. General Harmon had stopped talking on her radio. She was watching the tablet screen. Walsh had moved closer without appearing to move closer. He was now 6 feet from Elaine, and the expression he wore had shifted into something harder and less readable than the earlier discomfort. The video ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. When it ended, the screen showed a still frame of the empty room. Briggs had moved out of frame before cutting the feed and a phone number in the lower right corner. Virginia area code. A number Elaine did not recognize, but that Decker, looking over her shoulder, recognized immediately and said nothing about. For a moment, nobody in the immediate group spoke. Then Walsh said quietly, "How is that possible?" He did not mean the live stream. He meant the man on it. He meant the report Killed in Action, Afghanistan, August 2019, and the fact that the man described by that report was sitting in a room somewhere in the continental United States telling a story that contradicted every official account of the night in question. Decker answered him. He kept his voice low. Dead soldiers stop being complicated when they stay dead. He said it the way someone says a thing they have understood for a long time and do not enjoy understanding. Elaine was still looking at the tablet. Something was happening in her face that she was working very hard to keep from happening, and the effort of keeping it contained was visible in the specific way that contained things become visible in the stillness, in the controlled quality of her breathing, in the slight tension at the corners of her jaw. She had spent 3 years carrying the weight of 7 deaths. She had accepted that weight. She had folded it into the fabric of her daily life, the counting of rounds, the filing of forms, the deliberate insignificance of a person who has decided that the most honest response to causing harm is to remove yourself from any position where you might cause more. She had not been looking for exoneration. She had not been waiting for a revelation. And now a dead man was telling her that the weight she had been carrying had been placed on her by someone else's hands. It took Harmon 11 minutes to clear the range. Not entirely. The outer ring dispersed toward assignments when ordered to, and the ones who lingered were addressed individually by NCOs moving through the bleachers with quiet efficiency. Within those 11 minutes, the group around Elaine had contracted to 9 people. Harmon Decker Walsh, Sergeant First Class, Dana Mercer Hale, Ren Moss Finch, and Elaine herself. Harmon commandeered a conference room in the headquarters building. Long table-worn chairs, a projector that worked maps on 2 walls, air conditioning that provided more noise than temperature regulation. Moss set up 3 laptops and a communications array that was not standard issue equipment, and nobody asked where it had come from. What they assembled over the next 2 hours was this. The man Elaine had shot on the night of August 12, 2019 was not Ahmad Rashidi. Ahmad Rashidi was a construction. A name and a photograph assembled from component parts and inserted into the intelligence pipeline at a point high enough that by the time the targeting package reached Go7's briefing, it had been validated by 3 separate agencies and carried the paperwork weight of something thoroughly boringly real. The actual target was a man named Dmitry Volkov, 54 years old at the time of his death, a former officer of Russian military intelligence who had been recruited by the CIA in 2015 and had for 2 years provided information of genuine and significant value, the kind of information that saved lives in the specific countable way that good intelligence sometimes saves lives. Then Volkov had begun selling, not to a single buyer, to several. He had taken what the CIA had taught him about what America knew and did not know about Russian operations in Afghanistan, and he had turned that knowledge into a commodity purchased by people whose interests were not aligned with American interests. 23 operatives had died in the subsequent 18 months in circumstances attributed at the time to operational security failures and the general hazard of the work. Deputy Director Alan Prescott, at that point, 18 months from retirement and 30 years into a career defined by managing exactly these kinds of problems, had assessed the situation and arrived at a solution. Volkov could not be killed officially. The asset relationship, however compromised, was documented. An official termination would require disclosure of the original recruitment, the subsequent intelligence failures, the deaths of 23 operatives, and the chain of decisions leading from the first to the last. It would require congressional notification, an inspector general review, a paper trail with Prescott's name on nearly every page. There was a cleaner option. A man who resembled a photograph of a fictional terrorist placed in the right location at the right time in front of the most precise and reliable trigger the United States military possessed. A targeting package that would survive any subsequent review because every agency that might review it had been fed the same false intelligence. A team on the ground, Omega Team, 6 good soldiers who had the misfortune of being in theater available and exactly suited for the support role the operation required. The problem with Omega Team was the same problem Prescott had with Volkov. They were witnesses to operational details. They had been briefed. They had been inside the compound. They knew what they had seen and what they had not seen, and what they had not seen was anything consistent with the man in the briefing. The solution to that problem had been shaped charges placed in the compound's eastern structure before Omega Team ever entered. Elaine set down the documents she had been reading and placed both hands flat on the table. Nobody spoke. She had known in the distant way you can know something while simultaneously keeping it at a remove that the investigation into Kandahar had been incomplete. Investigations into classified operations conducted by classified units using classified assets are always incomplete by design. The question is whether the incompleteness is structural, the ordinary redaction of sources and methods, or whether it is purposeful in a more deliberate sense. She knew now which kind it had been. The 4 names that had been living in the back of her mind for 3 years shifted slightly in their residence there. They remained. They would always remain. But they rearranged themselves around a different understanding, and the weight of them changed shape, and the shape it changed into had an edge to it. Decker was watching her from across the table. He had the look of a man who had suspected this for some time and was taking no satisfaction in being correct. "Where did this come from?" Harmon asked. She meant the documents. The 3 years of assembled evidence that Marcus Briggs had apparently been building from whatever location he was not identifying. Moss looked up from his laptop. He had been tracing the digital path of the documents with the focus of someone for whom this kind of work is a pleasure, regardless of what the work reveals. 3 layers of routing, 2 proxy servers, a source IP, that resolved to a residential address in Northern Virginia he was confident was a shell. Whoever put this together knew what they were doing, he said, and had a long time to do it. Walsh had been silent for most of the 2 hours. He sat at the far end of the table with his forearms on the surface and his eyes moving between the documents and Elaine. The recalibration that had started on the range was continuing. He was not a man who arrived at conclusions quickly, but once he arrived, he held them with conviction. He was arriving now. He said the phone number on the video. Virginia area code, Langley prefix, Decker confirmed. Walsh said, which means either Briggs has someone inside or whoever he's working with does. Or both, Wren said quietly from his corner. He had not spoken much, but when he did, the words carried the weight of someone who has been sitting with certain knowledge for a long time and is now for the first time able to put it on the table. Harmon's phone vibrated again. She read the message fully before putting the phone away. Her hand remained on it a moment longer than necessary, which in a woman of Harmon's discipline was the equivalent of a visible reaction. She said Briggs has requested a meeting, 2 o'clock this afternoon, a coffee shop in Colorado Springs called the Iron Cup. He wants Elaine to come alone. The room processed this. Decker said without inflection, "That's not happening." Elaine looked at the phone number still visible on Audrey Finch's tablet, sitting open on the table. She thought about the compound in the valley. She thought about 4 names. She thought about 3 years of counting ammunition under fluorescent light. "I'll go," she said. The preparation had the quality of a field operation assembled from available materials, not ideal but functional. Walsh volunteered for reconnaissance before Decker had finished describing the location, and the speed of the offer told Elaine something about where Walsh had landed after 2 hours around this table. Mercer said she would handle counter-surveillance. Hale took electronic coverage without being asked. They were not doing this for Elaine, and Elaine understood that and was grateful for the understanding. They were doing it because 4 soldiers were dead in a way that made every soldier in the room complicit by proximity, and the only available response to that kind of complicity was to be useful. Decker took her aside while the others worked. He was brief because Decker had always been brief. He told her that what she was walking into was designed to be visible, and that visibility was both the protection and the exposure, and that the difference between them would depend entirely on how the next 6 hours unfolded. He would be behind her. Not with her. Behind her. The distinction was hers to draw. She said she understood. He said he knew. He told her anyway. The JAG officer arrived at 11:40. His name was Captain Nathan Greer, and he wore his precision like a second uniform, wire-rimmed glasses, every button exactly placed the manner of someone who has built an identity around the careful management of language and procedure. He came into the conference room with 2 assistants and a document folder, and he addressed Elaine by rank with the courtesy of someone delivering bad news behind good manners. He informed her that any disclosure of classified material related to a certain operation, which he referred to by a name that was not the name Elaine had been given in her original briefing, and not the name it had carried in the one declassified summary she had been allowed to read during the investigation, and not the name Moss had found in the budget fragment that morning, would constitute a violation of her security clearance and subject her to federal prosecution. Elaine let him finish. Then she asked, in the same quiet voice she used for most things, why the operation had 3 different names across 3 different documents over 3 years. Greer's composure was professional. It did not crack. But it paused in a way composure pauses when a question has landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to reach, and the pause was its own kind of answer. He said he was not in a position to speak to operational naming conventions. Elaine said she understood. She said nothing else, and after a moment Greer collected his folder and his assistants and left the room, and Decker, who had been standing near the door with his hands behind his back throughout, watched him go with an expression that did not require translation. Walsh from his end of the table. "They're nervous." "Yes," Harmon said. Walsh's reconnaissance report on the Iron Cup was delivered in the clipped language of professional habit rather than completed task. Single-story building, wire into corner location, glass front, 2 entrances, Neighboring structures on both sides providing multiple elevated positions overlooking the interior. Limited escape routes. High civilian density at 2 in the afternoon on a weekday. Anyone establishing coverage on that location would have been in place by 10 in the morning. Mercer reported 2 vehicles on the block that had not moved since she began observing at noon. A man in a parked sedan reading a newspaper with the stillness of someone not reading. A woman at a window table with a laptop whose gaze tracked the entrance at intervals too regular to be accidental. Protection or surveillance, Mercer said. Could be both. Elaine was putting on a Kevlar vest in the adjacent room when Decker knocked and entered. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. You're going to hear something in that room that reorganizes everything, he said. You've been carrying one version of Kandahar for 3 years. Briggs is going to hand you a different one. Make sure you understand what you're doing with it before you do anything with it. She looked at him the way of someone who has been through enough that advice, however well-intended, arrives as a reminder rather than a revelation. I know, she said. He nodded once. Step back. Let her pass. The drive to Colorado Springs took 32 minutes. Elaine rode with Decker in an unmarked vehicle, and Walsh, Mercer, and Hale took 3 separate routes. The radio channel they were using was clean as of that morning, though Hale had noted this only meant what it meant as of that morning. They were 2 miles from the Iron Cup when Hale's voice came through the earpiece. 3 vehicles behind you, consistent distance, rotating positions, military or intelligence training. They are not making any serious effort to be invisible. Elaine did not turn around. Let them follow, she said. Decker glanced at her. Better to see them, she said, than to lose them. She arrived at 2 o'clock precisely. The afternoon light was flat and warm, and the street smelled of coffee and exhaust in the dry edge of late summer in Colorado. She walked through the front door of the Iron Cup and scanned the room once before she saw him. Marcus Briggs was sitting in the far corner. He had positioned himself exactly as a trained soldier positions himself in an unfamiliar space back to the wall. Both entrances visible the window to his right, providing natural light without making him a silhouette. He was older than his service photographs. Gray had come into his hair at the temples. His face carried the wear of someone who has lived under sustained pressure for a long time, the wear that comes not from age but from a quality of wakefulness that never fully turns off. He saw her, and his face did something complicated. Not relief exactly. The release of a tension held so long that releasing it produces its own kind of pain. She walked to the table and sat across from him. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Briggs said, "You look like someone who hasn't slept in 3 years." "So do you," Elaine said. He almost smiled. He reached into the bag at his feet and placed a tablet on the table between them. Files organized by date, folders nested inside folders. "This is 3 years," he said. "Everything Owen Taft and Neil Baxter and I have been able to build. We are going to walk through it. I'm going to tell you what happened in that valley. And you are going to hear some of it and want to stop me. I need you to not stop me." She looked at the first file. It was the original operations order for August 12, 2019. Not the version she had been given in her briefing, but one that predated it by 6 days and contained in the target description field a name she did not recognize. Dmitry Volkov, she read. Briggs watched her. "He wasn't a terrorist," she said. "No," Briggs said. She turned to the next file. Then the next. The afternoon light moved across the table. Hale's voice was quiet in her earpiece, reporting the positions of the vehicles outside. Elaine read 3 years of assembled evidence about the night that had organized her life into before and after. She was on the 7th file when the front door of the Iron Cup opened. The man who entered wore a charcoal suit with the fit of tailoring rather than luck. 55 years old, silver-haired. The bearing of someone who has spent a career in rooms where the decisions are more consequential than the furniture suggests. He moved through the coffee shop with the unhurried quality of a man who has decided that urgency belongs to people who are not in control of a situation. She had never met him in person, but she had seen his photograph in a classified document 9 years ago, and again in a budget oversight summary 4 years after that. She knew his name, she knew his title. She knew the distance between what he was responsible for and what he claimed a responsibility for. Deputy Director Alan Prescott of the Defense Intelligence Agency came to the table, looked at Elaine and at Briggs and at the tablet between them, and pulled out the chair beside Elaine with the ease of a man arriving at a destination he chose. "Sergeant Carter," he said. "Mr. Briggs." He smoothed the lapel with one hand. "I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time." He reached into his inside pocket. Not for a weapon, for a phone. He set it on the table between his hands, screen facing up, and his thumb rested on it with the casual familiarity of a man who knows exactly what the device is capable of. The afternoon light came through the glass front of the iron cup and fell across the table. Elaine looked at the phone and at Prescott and understood that the next 60 seconds were going to determine the shape of everything that followed. She moved first. She did not reach for a weapon. The move Elaine made was smaller than that and more precise, and it was over before Prescott's nervous system had finished registering that it had begun. Her right hand came across the table in a single controlled arc, the palm driving into the outer edge of his wrist with the force of someone who knows exactly how much pressure a result requires and applies exactly that amount and no more. The phone skittered across the table and off the edge and landed face down on the floor of the iron cup with a sound that was surprisingly loud in the suddenly quiet coffee shop. Prescott's hand closed on empty air. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Elaine with an expression that moved through surprise and arrived at something more considered. He was not a man who was often surprised. The experience appeared to be instructive rather than destabilizing. "That was a dead man's switch," Elaine said. Her voice occupied the same quiet register it always did. Not threatening, stating. Prescott straightened in his chair and adjusted his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man restoring order to his appearance, because order in appearance is what you maintain when other forms of order are temporarily unavailable. "You're faster than the file suggests," he said. "The file is 3 years old," Elaine said. Briggs had not moved during the exchange. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on Prescott with the steadiness of someone who has been preparing for this specific moment for a long time and is now inside it and finding that preparation was the right approach. The coffee shop had gone the specific quiet of a public space in which the civilians present have collectively registered that something is happening that they do not understand and are not sure whether to leave. A barista behind the counter had taken 2 steps back from the register. A man at a laptop near the window had closed the laptop. Through her earpiece, Hale's voice was steady. "The vehicles outside have not moved. 5 additional people on the street who were not there 20 minutes ago. Walsh has the 2nd floor of the office building across the street. 1 individual repositioning near the window." Elaine did not look away from Prescott. "Nothing is going to explode today," Briggs said. He said it directly to Prescott, and the way he said it communicated that this was not a reassurance but a disclosure. Prescott heard the distinction. Something shifted in the careful arrangement of his expression. Briggs placed a small drive on the table beside the tablet. He looked at Prescott with the steadiness of a man who has prepared for this specific face across this specific table for a long time. "The office building," Briggs said. "Owen Taft and Neil Baxter cleared it at 6 this morning. Whatever your people placed there last night has been removed and is currently in the custody of individuals who will know what to do with it. Your communications to the device in your pocket have been rerouted since you walked through that door. You have been talking to a server in a basement in Reston, Virginia for the last 4 minutes. The switch was never live." Prescott was quiet for a moment. He looked at Briggs with something closer to respect than anger. The anger was present, but it was sitting behind the respect the way a secondary emotion sits behind a primary one when a man is disciplined enough to know which one to lead with. 3 years, Prescott said. 3 years, Briggs confirmed. Outside, a vehicle stopped on the street, then 2 more. Through the glass front of the iron cup, Elaine could see the profile of military police transport, a civilian sedan with government plates, and behind it, a vehicle she recognized from the Fort Carson motor pool. General Ruth Harmon entered the iron cup with the manner of someone who has been thinking about this location for several hours and has clear intentions regarding it. Behind her came Brigadier General Howard Crane, and behind Crane came 4 military police with the careful positioning of people briefed on the space in advance. Harmon looked at the table. She looked at Prescott. She looked at Elaine. She produced a document from the folder under her arm and placed it in front of Prescott without ceremony. "Deputy Director Prescott, you are being detained under emergency authorization signed by the Secretary of Defense at 11:43 this morning, following review of materials transmitted through the Inspector General's emergency channel 4 hours ago. The charges being prepared include conspiracy, obstruction, and conduct unbecoming as a starting point." Prescott looked at the document, read it again. He looked at Elaine. "The secretary signed this based on what exactly?" "The claims of a disgraced operative and a man who has been legally dead for 3 years. Based on this," Crane said. He set a second folder on the table. "Financial records, operational documents, communications, and at the top a photograph. Prescott at a forward operating base in Afghanistan. The date stamp read August 10th, 2019, 2 days before Kandahar. Prescott was not supposed to have been in Afghanistan in August of 2019. His official travel records placed him in Washington through that entire month. The discrepancy was not a small administrative error. Taft was present at FOB Chapman the morning Prescott arrived, Briggs said. He saw the meetings, he saw who was present and what material was moved through the base in the 48 hours before the mission. He has been prepared to testify to that for approximately 2 years and has been waiting for a context in which that testimony would not be immediately classified into non-existence. Prescott set the document down on the table. He looked at Elaine with the expression of a man who has arrived at the end of a sequence he initiated and is making a final assessment of the outcome. He was not panicked. He was not performing composure. He was genuinely composed, and the genuineness of it was more unsettling than performance would have been. "You understand what you're opening," he said. She said nothing. "Volkov compromised 23 of our people," Prescott continued. 23, not statistics. Officers with families and careers and years of service who are dead because a man we trusted decided that our intelligence was a commodity. I made a decision. It was not a legal decision, and I understand the implications of that, but I made it in the context of a responsibility to the living, and I will not apologize for the arithmetic of it. Elaine looked at him for a long moment. "Park," she said. "Johnson, Thompson, Williams." Prescott was quiet. "Those were their names," she said. "The 4 members of Omega Team who died in that compound. Not the 3 who survived, the 4 who didn't. I have been saying those names in that order every morning for 3 years. Do you know them, not as designations, as names?" Prescott did not answer. "They had names," she said. "They are not the denominator in your arithmetic. They are not a cost that balances against a benefit. They were soldiers who trusted that the mission they were given was real. And you used that trust to solve a problem you created, and then you buried them under a classification stamp and spent 3 years making sure no one could find them." The coffee shop was absolutely silent. Prescott's face had the quality of a man who has heard an argument he has long refused to engage with, not because it is beneath him, but because engaging would require acknowledging a framework he has spent his career building walls against. The framework in which the people who execute decisions carry the same weight as the people who make them. The framework in which arithmetic has faces. He did not speak again before the military police reached the table. They were precise about the process. Professional. Prescott stood when asked which was the right thing to do, and also Elaine suspected a last exercise of the control that was in every other respect fully removed from him. He was cuffed with the formal efficiency of people following protocol, and he walked toward the door of the Iron Cup with the bearing of a man who has not yet decided what the rest of his life is going to look like, but is resolved to maintain posture while he figures it out. At the door he stopped. He turned back toward the table, not toward Elaine specifically, but toward the room, and he said, "This goes deeper than me. Whatever you think you've resolved today, you should know that." Then he was through the door and into the September afternoon, and the glass front of the Iron Cup showed him moving toward the waiting vehicles with 4 military police around him and the people on the street with their phones raised, and the news vehicles that had materialized on the block with the speed of institutions that monitor military radio traffic. Walsh's voice came through the earpiece. "It's on every network. Live." Elaine sat at the table for a moment after Prescott was gone. Briggs sat across from her with the look of a man at the end of a long effort who is discovering that completion and relief are not the same condition. He had been carrying this for 3 years. The carrying had given his days structure and purpose and a reason to remain careful. The ending of it left him in a space he had not had time to fully imagine, because imagining the end would have been a distraction from reaching it. Owen Taft and Neil Baxter came through the bus entrance of the Iron Cup 15 minutes later. They were both older than their service photographs. Taft had burn scarring on his left forearm that he did not cover, and Baxter moved with a slight asymmetry in his stride that suggested a healed injury that had healed imperfectly. They came to the table and they looked at Elaine, and nobody said anything for a moment that lasted the length of several ordinary moments. Then Taft said, "We never blamed you." It was a simple sentence. It contained in its simplicity 3 years of things that could not be compressed into language, but had been waiting for a container, and the container it found was those 4 words and the directness with which they were offered. Elaine looked at him. She said, "I know that now." She said it without qualification, without the addendum of, "but I blamed myself," or, "but that doesn't change what happened." She let the sentence be what it was. Baxter sat down across from her. He said, "The 4 who didn't make it, they knew the risk was operational. They signed the same contract we did. That doesn't make what Prescott did acceptable, But it means they were soldiers doing a soldier's work, and the person responsible for their deaths is currently being put into a government vehicle outside this coffee shop. Elaine nodded slowly. Not in agreement exactly. In the acknowledgement that this was a truth she was going to need to learn to hold alongside the other truth, which was that 4 soldiers were dead, and she had been the mechanism of one of those deaths, and both of those things were permanently true and permanently present, and the work of a lifetime was going to be living in the space between them with honesty. The conference room commandeered that morning was occupied again by 9 o'clock that evening. Briggs's documents were spread across the table in organized sequence, and Harmon and Crane had spent 4 hours with 2 intelligence officers going through them, with the focused attention of people discovering that a thing they thought they understood the shape of is considerably larger than the shape they understood. The USB Briggs had handed to Harmon at the Iron Cup contained what he had been willing to show in that context: the operational records, the communications, the financial flows, the photograph of Prescott at FOB Chapman. But there was a second layer to the drive that Harmon did not reach until 9:47, when she opened a folder labeled with a date that predated Kandahar by 11 years. She read the first document, then the second. She set both down on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then she looked at the room. God help us, she said. It was not Kandahar that was the anomaly. Kandahar was the 11th operation in a sequence stretching back over a decade and across 4 administrations, each one built on the same architecture: the construction of a fictional target, the use of a sanctioned military asset to execute it, the elimination of witnesses through collateral means. Prescott had not invented the method. He had inherited it, refined it, and applied it with the efficiency of a man who has learned a system thoroughly enough to improve it. 11 operations. The number of dead across all 11 was a number Harmon read aloud once and did not read aloud again. Walsh, sitting at the far end of the table, was silent for a long time. Then he said, "How does something like this run for 10 years without someone seeing it?" Decker answered, "The same way anything runs for 10 years without someone seeing it. You make sure the people who might see it are not in a position to speak. You make sure the official record is clean, and you make sure that anyone who gets close enough to the truth has already been provided with a credible alternative version to carry instead." "Like a finding of friendly fire," Walsh said. "Like a finding of friendly fire," Decker confirmed. Elaine was looking at the document. The 11 entries. The dates and locations and the designation codes of the military assets used in each one. One of the codes in the 3rd entry from the bottom was hers. She had been used once. Some of the codes in other entries appeared multiple times. She thought about the people behind those codes. She thought about what they were carrying. She thought about whether they knew as she had not known, or whether they were like her, somewhere counting rounds under fluorescent light, carrying a weight placed on them by other hands, waiting for a Marcus Briggs who had not come yet. Harmon closed the folder. She looked at Elaine, and the look had something in it that Harmon did not often allow into looks. Something that was not quite apology because Harmon had not done this and was not responsible for it, but that acknowledged the institution she represented had done it, and that the institution and the woman in front of her shared membership in that institution, and that this created an obligation no rank distinction could fully redistribute. "Sergeant First Class Carter," she said, "I have been authorized to offer you full reinstatement at your previous rank with back pay for 3 years and your choice of assignment." Elaine said nothing immediately. "The offer is real," Crane said. The secretary signed the authorization alongside the detention order. "There is a desire at the highest levels to correct the record." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The record is not the part I'm concerned about." Harmon waited. "There are other people," Elaine said. "Other designation codes in those files. People who went through what I went through and may not know yet what I know tonight. Restoring my record doesn't find them. It doesn't tell them what their record is missing. It doesn't give them what Briggs gave me." Walsh said, "What does?" Elaine looked at the table. "At the organized evidence. At the 11 entries. Someone who knows how to look for them," she said. The trial of Alan Prescott began 11 weeks after the Iron Cup. It ran for 19 days. The courtroom filled every morning with the specific atmosphere of proceedings that people understand, even those peripheral to them, are going to be referenced for a long time. Journalists occupied every permitted space. Former intelligence officers sat in the gallery with the careful expressions of people assessing how close the fire is to their own position. Elaine testified for 3 days. She sat at the witness table in a federal courthouse in Washington and answered questions with the measured precision she applied to everything. And the jury heard her describe the night of August 12, 2019, in the kind of detail that comes from 3 years of involuntary repetition. The mountain, the cold, the scope, the man crossing from one building to another in a cone of amber light, the shot, the explosion, the 11 minutes of running, the ash and the silence at the bottom of the valley. She described the weight she had carried since that night. She did not dramatize it. She described it the way a person describes a physical condition, as something present and factual with specific effects on specific aspects of daily life. The jury heard Briggs describe what he had seen inside the compound in the minutes before the explosion, the charges already in place, the configuration that no legitimate military operation would have produced, the understanding that arrived in his chest before the intellectual processing caught up with it. They heard Owen Taft describe Alan Prescott at F.O. Chapman on the morning of August 10, 2019. The meetings, the material. The conversations Taft had not fully understood at the time and had spent 3 years understanding afterward. Prescott was present every day in the same charcoal suit, with the same composed bearing, in the same genuine unperformed self-possession. He listened to testimony with attention. He conferred quietly with his attorneys. He was in the limited sense of courtroom behavior a model defendant. On the 17th day during a recess, Prescott passed within a few feet of Elaine in the corridor outside the courtroom. He stopped. His attorney put a hand on his arm. He did not move. He looked at Elaine for a moment and said quietly, without the audience he had always seemed to require for his convictions, I still believe the accounting was correct. I want you to know that I understand it was not a legal belief, but I need you to know I did not do it carelessly. Elaine looked at him. She said, I know you didn't do it carelessly. That's the part that's hardest to forgive. She walked back into the courtroom. Prescott stood in the corridor for a moment longer, then followed. On the 19th day, the verdict was read. 9 counts, guilty on all. The sentence was substantial and appropriate, and it settled nothing because the 9 counts did not encompass the full architecture, and the full architecture contained names and institutions not present in that courtroom and unlikely to enter any courtroom in the foreseeable future. Everyone in the room understood this. Nobody said it because saying it would have required a precision about the limits of justice that the moment did not allow. Marcus Briggs attended the final day. He sat 2 rows behind Elaine in the gallery and did not speak to her during the proceedings. When the verdict was read, she heard him exhale slowly. One long breath, the kind that contains something held for a long time and is now with the understanding that it will never be fully released, being let go by degrees. After the courtroom emptied, they stood on the steps outside in the November cold. Elaine said, "Is it what you thought it would be?" He was quiet. "No," he said. She said, "It's not enough." He considered that honestly the way he considered most things. He said, "It's something. Something is not nothing." She looked at the street, the government buildings, the ordered institutional regularity of a city that processes decisions of enormous consequence inside the ordinary architecture of workdays and document folders. 4 names, she said. 4 names, he agreed. Neither of them said anything else about it. There wasn't anything else to say that the names didn't already contain. 6 months later, Fort Carson looked the same from the outside. The mountains to the west still caught the early light before the range did. The bleachers at Range 7 were still metal and still got hot by mid-morning. The storage room in the logistics building still smelled of solvent and cardboard. The name on the door of the office at the end of the corridor in the marksmanship facility was new. Ghost 7 Advanced Marksmanship Academy. Elaine had chosen the name after thinking about it for a long time because she did not make decisions about things that mattered without thinking about them carefully. She had considered whether the name was too self-referential, whether it announced too much about the program's origin, whether it would create the wrong impression about what the program was. She decided that the wrong impression was the impression that the program was anything other than what it was, a direct consequence of what had happened to 7 people on a mountainside in Afghanistan, 4 of whom had not come home, and a direct commitment to ensuring the architecture of that outcome could not be easily repeated. The inaugural class had 12 students. Walsh was the first name on the enrollment list. He had submitted it 36 hours after the Iron Cup before the program had a structure or a location or an official designation. That told Elaine everything she needed to know about where Walsh had ended up after the conference room and the coffee shop and the evening reading 11 entries in a classified folder. He arrived for the first day of instruction without ceremony, took a seat in the second row, and did not reference the morning at Range 7 except once briefly in private when he told her that he had been wrong about what he was looking at that morning and that he did not intend to make that particular mistake again. She had said, "That's all any of us can do." Mercer was the second name on the enrollment list. Then Hale, Owen Taft, and Neil Baxter were guest instructors. They came twice a month and sat at the front of the room, and what they contributed was not technique or calculation. What they contributed was the knowledge of men who had survived something designed to kill them and spent 3 years understanding why, which was a kind of knowledge that no curriculum could produce and no instructor who had not lived it could adequately transmit. On the morning of the first day of the first class, Elaine stood at the front of the room while 12 students settled into their seats. She turned on the projector. The image on the screen was a photograph taken at a forward operating base in Afghanistan in the first week of August 2019. 7 people, casual and unposed, the kind of photograph taken because someone has a camera and the light is good and nobody expects the moment to become anything other than what it is. All 7 were in uniform. All 7 were looking at the camera or just past it with the easy familiarity of people who have been through enough together that the presence of a camera produces neither performance nor avoidance. Park, Johnson, Thompson, Williams, Briggs, Taft-Brown, Baxter. Elaine let the photograph sit on the screen without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "You are going to spend the next several months learning things about long-range marksmanship that will take years to fully integrate. The technical knowledge is real and it matters, and we will work on it every day. But that is not the reason this program exists." She looked at the room. This program exists because 4 of the 7 people in this photograph were used by their own institution and killed by their own institution and buried under a classification stamp by the same people who sent them to do the job. It exists because the mechanisms that allowed that to happen were not exceptional or unprecedented. They were not the work of a single bad actor operating outside a functioning system. They were the product of a system that had in specific ways and over a long period of time developed the capacity to treat the people inside it as instruments rather than as people. Walsh was watching her from the second row with the attention of a man who has decided to learn something and intends to learn it completely. Your job, she continued, is not only to be technically excellent, your job is to be technically excellent and to know the difference between an order that is difficult and an order that is wrong, and to know what to do when you encounter the second kind. The hardest targets are not at 3,800 meters. The hardest targets are the ones you cannot see until you know what to look for. She clicked to the next slide. The 4 names, Park, Johnson, Thompson, Williams, not photographs. Just names in plain block letters, the same font she had been writing them in every morning for 3 years. Clean and specific and resistant to abstraction. They had names, she said. That's where we start. The evening that Audrey Finch came to Elaine's office with the tablet was a Tuesday in December, 4 months after the trial, and 7 months after the morning at Range 7, when everything buried for 3 years had begun its return to the surface. The academy was quiet at that hour. The last class had ended at 5. The building held the stillness of a place that has been full of people and is now empty in a way that retains the impression of their presence. The chairs not fully pushed in a jacket left on a hook near the door, a coffee cup on the corner of the windowsill. Elaine was at her desk reviewing the following week's curriculum. The technical sections were solid. The ethical framework sections were still being refined, which was appropriate because the ethical framework sections addressed questions that do not arrive at final answers. Questions about duty and judgment and the specific courage required to refuse an order from inside a chain of command that has learned to disguise wrong as necessary. Those sections would always need refinement. That was part of the point. Finch knocked and entered. She was holding the tablet with both hands, and her expression had the quality of someone carrying information they are uncertain how to deliver. In the months since September, she had developed the skill of remaining present in situations that exceeded her training, which was the most important skill available to someone in her position and the least teachable. She was getting better at it. She held the tablet out. Elaine looked at it. The screen showed a live stream. A room with no identifiable features, a single lamp shadows doing the same careful work they had done in Briggs's recording 7 months earlier. A figure in the frame with their face outside the direct light. The voice was electronically modified, pitch shifted, and smoothed in a way that removed identifying characteristics while leaving the emotional texture of what was being said intact. Ghost 7, Prescott was a door, not the building. The architecture he operated inside is still standing, and there are others maintaining it who were not in that courtroom, and there are people inside it who want it to come down and cannot do so from where they are standing without someone on the outside who knows what they are looking at. Someone who has already read the 11 entries and understands what they represent. Someone who knows the difference between a target and the system that produced it. The stream paused. If you are willing to look, there is a number at the bottom of this screen. Elaine looked at the number. She looked at the photograph on the wall above her desk, the 4 names in block letters that she had put there the first day she moved into the office and had not moved since. She thought about the other designation codes in that folder, the ones she had not found. The people behind them, who were still in their supply rooms, still in their counting and their filing and their careful invisibility carrying weights placed on them by hands they might never identify without help. She thought about Prescott's words on the courthouse steps. This goes deeper than me. She had known he was right. She had known it the moment Harmon read the folder in that conference room and looked at the ceiling for a long moment before she could speak. 9 counts covered 1 man. The folder contained 11 operations. The arithmetic was not difficult. Finch was watching her. Elaine set the tablet on the desk. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number on the screen one more time, and then she dialed it, and it rang twice, and someone answered without speaking. She said, "This is Ghost 7. A pause on the line. "I'm told you have a problem that requires someone who knows the difference between a target and a door," she said. "Tell me what you see from where you're standing, and then we'll talk about the shot." Through the window of her office, the Colorado night was clear and cold, and the mountains to the west were dark shapes against a sky full of stars very far away and very steady, burning with the patient brightness of things that have been exactly where they are for a long time and expect to continue. The voice on the phone began to speak. Elaine listened. She had spent 3 years in a supply room because she believed the most honest response to harm was to remove herself from any position where she might cause more. She understood now that this was not honesty. It was the version of accountability that required nothing from her except the willingness to disappear, which was the easiest form of accountability available and the least useful to the people who needed something from her that only she could provide. The 4 names on the wall were not a monument. They were a direction. She had a team now. She had 12 students learning to see what most people are trained not to look for. She had Taft and Baxter and Briggs, who had spent 3 years building the architecture of exposure from the inside of their own disappearance. She had Harmon, who had pocketed a message from Langley and kept asking questions anyway. She had Walsh, who had been wrong about what he was looking at one September morning and had enrolled in the first available class to correct that. None of them were instruments. All of them had names. The voice on the phone was describing a file, a designation code, a date, a location. Elaine wrote it down. She had been training for this her entire life, not just the technical precision, not just the ability to read wind and calculate for rotation and find the still point between heartbeats where the shot lives. She had been training for the willingness to remain in position long after the comfortable moment for action has passed, because the shot that matters is not always the one immediately available. Sometimes it belongs only to the person who has stayed clear-eyed and honest long enough to see it. The debt to the dead is not paid by grief. It is paid by attention. She kept writing.